The air inside the main hall of the Grand View Hotel was thick, filled with the mixed scent of expensive perfume, roasting lamb, and the sharp tang of polished floor wax. It was a Friday night, which meant the annual charity gala was in full swing. Outside the tall glass walls, the city lights blurred into streaks of yellow and white. But inside, everything was sharp and clear. The room was buzzing with low, polite conversations and the gentle clinking of silverware against fine china. Julia.
I'll move through the maze of round tables like a ghost.
She was wearing the standard black uniform, the fabric stretching slightly across her shoulders because it had been a long time since she last ate a full meal. In her hands, she carried a large silver tray loaded with champagne flutes. The glasses sparkled under the soft, warm light of the crystal chandeliers hanging from the high ceiling. She had to be careful. One slip, one wobble, and the tray would come crashing down. That would mean the cost of the broken glasses, deducted from her pay, and probably her job. She couldn't afford to lose this job. Not tonight. She walked past a table where 4 older men sat, laughing loudly with their heads thrown back. They wore tuxedos that looked tailored specifically for them, the fabric hugging their frames perfectly. They didn't even look at her. To them, she was just part of the furniture, a vessel to bring them more drinks. Julia was used to it. She kept her eyes forward, her back straight, and a neutral expression plastered on her face. It was a mask she had perfected over years of working in service. "Champagne, sir?" she asked softly, stopping at the table. One of the men waved a hand dismissively without even turning his head. Julia didn't take it personally. She simply turned on her heel and moved toward the next group. This was her reality. The room was divided into 2 worlds. There was the world of the guests, who ate, drank, and laughed without a care in the world. And then there was her world, the world of the staff, rushing back and forth, trying to be invisible. It was exhausting work. Her feet throbbed inside her non-slip shoes, a dull ache that started in her arches and shot up her calves. She shifted the weight of the tray to her left shoulder, trying to give her right side a break. But the muscle still burned. Julia scanned the room quickly, her eyes darting toward the back corner. It was a dark spot, tucked away behind a large decorative fern and a heavy velvet curtain that led to the service corridors. That was where Lily was hiding. Lily was 7 years old. She was small for her age, with wild hair that refused to stay flat, no matter how much water Julia combed through it. Tonight, Lily was sitting on a small crate that the kitchen staff had smuggled out for her. She was wrapped in an oversized gray coat that belonged to one of the chefs. It swallowed her whole, making her look like a little bird burrowed into a nest. Lily had her knees pulled up to her chest, and a small notepad rested on them. She was drawing with a stubby pencil, her tongue sticking out slightly in concentration. Seeing her there made Julia's heart squeeze tight. The plan had been for Lily to stay with Mrs. Gable down the hall. Mrs. Gable was an elderly woman who sometimes watched Lily for a few dollars. But an hour before Julia's shift started, Mrs. Gable had called. Her blood pressure was high, and she said she couldn't watch a hyperactive child tonight. The panic that had risen in Julia's throat was still there, lingering like a bad taste. She couldn't miss the shift. She needed the money for rent, which was already 3 days late. She also couldn't leave Lily alone in their small apartment. Not in that neighborhood, not at night. So she had done what she had to do. She had brought Lily here, sneaking her in through the delivery entrance. It was against every rule in the handbook. If the manager, a tall man with a temper named Mr. Henderson, found out, Julia would be fired on the spot. She had begged Lily to stay quiet, to stay hidden, to not move until Julia came to get her. Julia adjusted the tray again and walked toward the bar to refill it. As she passed the corner, she risked a tiny glance. Lily looked up, her big eyes meeting her mother's. Julia offered a quick, tight smile and put a finger to her lips. Lily nodded seriously and went back to her drawing. The pressure was immense. Every time a server entered the room, Julia flinched, thinking it might be Mr. Henderson doing his rounds. Every time a guest looked toward the corner, her breath hitched. She felt like she was holding a glass statue over a concrete floor. Just waiting for gravity to take over, she approached the bar where the bartender, a young guy named Tom, who always smelled like lemons, was wiping a glass. "Rough night?" Tom asked quietly, keeping his voice low so the guests wouldn't hear. The usual, Julia whispered, setting the tray down on the counter. Her arms felt light and floaty now that the weight was gone. She rolled her shoulders, trying to work out the knots. Just 2 more hours. Tom nodded and began to pour fresh champagne. He didn't ask about the coat in the corner. He knew better than to ask questions. In this line of work, you saw things, and you learned to look the other way if you wanted to help people survive. Did you hear? Tom asked, sliding a fresh glass onto her tray. The entertainment canceled. Something about a flat tire on the highway? They're scrambling to find a replacement. Julia looked up, surprised. But the music? It's been playing all night. They're using a playlist backup for now, Tom explained. But the donors aren't happy. They paid for live music. They paid for an experience. He nodded toward the grand piano sitting on a small stage at the front of the room. It was a beautiful instrument, black and glossy, reflecting the lights of the room. It sat silent now, looking lonely. Julia looked at the piano, then back at the corner where Lily sat. A memory flashed through her mind. It was a few months ago. They were walking past a music store downtown, the windows filled with guitars and keyboards. Lily had stopped dead in her tracks. She pressed her hands against the glass, staring at an electric piano in the display. She didn't ask for it. She never asked for anything. She just stood there, humming a tune Julia didn't recognize. It was a complex melody, not like the nursery rhymes the other kids sang at school. Julia shook the thought away. She didn't have time for memories or dreams. She picked up the heavy tray, the cold metal seeping through the black cloth that covered it. "Thanks, Tom," she said. "Stay safe out there," he replied. She turned back to the room. The atmosphere in the ballroom was shifting. The lack of live music was making the guests restless. The low hum of conversation was getting louder, turning into a dull roar. People were checking their watches, looking at their phones, signaling for waiters more aggressively. The mood was souring. It wasn't the elegant, peaceful evening they had paid for. They were bored, and bored wealthy people were dangerous. They complained about everything. The soup was too cold, the wine was too warm, the room was too drafty. Julia felt the tension rise in the air. It made her skin prickle. She knew she had to work faster, be more invisible, to avoid the brunt of their frustration. She navigated the crowded floor, dodging a waiter carrying a tray of hors d'oeuvres. She could feel the sweat starting to gather on her lower back. Soaking into her shirt, she made her way to a table near the front. A woman in a shimmering blue dress was sitting there, looking around with a bored expression. Julia approached her. "More water, ma'am?" Julia asked. The woman looked at her, her eyes scanning Julia's face as if looking for a flaw. Finally, she sighed. "Yes. And tell your manager that the silence in this room is depressing. We paid for a gala, not a library." "I will pass that along, ma'am," Julia said politely, her voice steady. She poured the water, her hand steady despite the trembling in her heart. As she finished, a loud feedback screech came from the speakers at the front, making everyone in the room wince and cover their ears. The noise cut out abruptly, leaving the room in a sudden, shocked silence that was quickly filling with angry mutters. Julia used the distraction to slip away. She moved toward the side of the room, needing a moment to just breathe. She found herself near the heavy velvet curtains that separated the dining area from the lobby. She leaned against the wall for just a second, closing her eyes. The exhaustion washed over her in waves. She thought about the pile of bills on the kitchen counter at home. She thought about the cold walk they would have to take to get to the bus stop later. She thought about Lily, sitting alone in the corner, probably wondering why her mother had to work so hard for people who didn't even see her. When she opened her eyes, she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. It was Lily. She had crawled out from behind the fern. She was standing near the edge of the tables, clutching her notebook. She wasn't looking at the people. She was looking at the stage. She was looking at the piano. Julia's heart skipped a beat. She started to move forward to wave her daughter back, but her feet felt like lead. The room was in chaos after the microphone feedback. Waiters were rushing to fix the sound system, and guests were complaining to the event coordinator. In that moment, Nobody was looking at the small child in the oversized coat who was walking toward the stage. Julia watched, paralyzed, as Lily walked past the tables, her eyes fixed on the silent instrument. She didn't look scared. She didn't look lost. She looked like she was being pulled by a magnet. The distance between the tables and the stage felt like 1,000,000 miles. And Julia knew she had to close it. She had to stop her before Mr. Henderson turned around and saw them. But for some reason, she couldn't scream. She couldn't move. She just watched. The feedback screech from the speakers had left a sharp ringing in everyone's ears. But it also did something strange to the room. For a few seconds, the guests were stunned into a grumpy silence. The low hum of expensive conversations died down, replaced by the sound of people shifting in their chairs. The rustling of silk napkins and the clinking of ice cubes settling in glasses. The atmosphere was heavy with impatience. People were checking their watches again, looking toward the exit, or signaling for servers to bring more drinks to drown out the boredom. From the dark corner where she had been hiding, she wasn't trying to sneak away. She was just moving toward the thing that had caught her eye. The gray coat she was wearing was far too big for her small frame, dragging slightly on the floor as she walked. The sleeves were so long that only her tiny fingertips poked out. To anyone glancing her way, she looked like a little lost bear cub, wandering through a forest of tall, elegant trees. Julia saw her move. From across the room, near the bar, she felt her stomach drop. The tray of empty glasses she was holding felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, to grab Lily, and to pull her back behind the safety of the heavy curtain. But she was stuck. The event coordinator, a stressed woman in a headset standing near the stage, was frantically waving at the sound technicians. Julia knew that if she moved now, she would draw attention to herself. And worse, to Lily. She decided to wait, to watch for a heartbeat, hoping Lily would just turn around and go back to her spot. But Lily didn't turn around. She walked with a steady determination that was rare for a 7-year-old. She navigated the maze of tables, dodging the waiters who were rushing back and forth with silver trays. She walked right past the man in the tuxedo who had waved her mother away earlier. He didn't notice her. He was busy complaining loudly to his tablemates about the lack of entertainment. He gestured with his fork, a piece of meat still stuck to the end of it, completely oblivious to the small child passing by his elbow. Lily's eyes were fixed straight ahead. At the front of the room, on a small raised platform, sat the grand piano. It was enormous. It was glossy black and seemed to shine under the spotlight that was aimed at it. Usually, there was a musician sitting there, a man with gray hair who played gentle jazz tunes. But tonight, the bench was empty. The piano sat there with its lid open, looking like a sleeping beast waiting to be woken up. To Julia, the piano was just another expensive object, something that cost more than she earned in a year. It was furniture. It was background noise. But to Lily, it was something else entirely. Julia remembered how Lily would tap her fingers on the kitchen table at home, beating out rhythms that didn't match the songs on the radio. It drove Julia crazy sometimes when she was trying to concentrate on paying bills. But now, watching her daughter walk toward that stage, Julia realized those taps weren't just noise. They were practice. Lily reached the edge of the dance floor. This was the danger zone. It was the open space between the tables and the stage. It was carpeted in a deep red color, soft and plush. If she stepped out there, she would be visible to everyone. Julia stopped breathing. She gripped the edge of the bar counter, her knuckles turning white. She looked around for Mr. Henderson, the manager. She saw him near the back doors, talking to one of the kitchen staff. He had his back turned to the room. This was the only chance. Lily took a step onto the red carpet, then another. She didn't run. She didn't look left or right. She walked with a quiet confidence, as if she had been invited to the stage. The oversized coat swished around her legs. She climbed the 2 small steps up to the platform. The wood creaked very softly under her sneakers. It's a sound that was lost in the growing murmur of the room. Once she was on the stage, the piano towered over her. It was massive. The keys looked like they were miles away from the floor. Lily walked up to the side of the bench. She looked at it for a moment, realizing it was too high for her to sit on comfortably and still reach the pedals. She didn't seem to care. She stood in front of the keys, her small body almost swallowed by the shadow of the instrument. A few people had noticed her now. A woman wearing a diamond necklace nudged her husband, pointing a manicured finger toward the stage. A waiter stopped mid-strain, holding a heavy coffee pot, his eyes widening in shock. The murmuring in the room began to change. It wasn't just complaints about the sound system anymore. People were whispering, asking each other who that child was and where the security was. Julia saw the heads turning. She saw the pointing. She felt the panic rising in her chest, hot and sharp. She had to move. She started to walk briskly toward the stage, weaving through the tables. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Please don't let him see her, she thought. Please don't let anyone stop her before I get there. But nobody moved to stop. Lily, maybe it was because she looked so small. Maybe it was because she looked so serious. Or maybe everyone was just too confused to react. The room held its collective breath, waiting to see what this small intruder would do. Lily reached out. Her hand was tiny, pale against the stark black of the piano body. She touched the fallboard, the piece of wood that covered the keys. It was down. The piano was closed. For a moment, Lily just stood there, her hand resting on the wood. She looked like she was listening to something that nobody else could hear. From the side of the room, the event coordinator finally noticed. Her mouth fell open. She took a step forward, lifting her hand to signal the security guard who stood by the entrance. The guard, a big man with a stern face, started walking toward the stage, his heavy boots thumping on the floor. Julia saw the guard moving. She started to run, abandoning her tray on a nearby table with a clatter. She didn't care about the noise now. She just had to get to her daughter. She was still 20 feet away. Lily pushed the fallboard. It was heavy. She had to use both hands. She leaned her weight into it, grunting slightly with the effort. The wood slid back, revealing the keys. They were white and black, long rows of possibilities. They reflected the light above, gleaming and pristine. The guard was halfway down the aisle. The event coordinator was shouting into her headset, probably calling for backup. The guests were now fully alert, their bored expressions replaced with curiosity and confusion. The silence in the room was no longer impatient. It was anticipatory. Lily didn't look at the guard. She didn't look at her mother running toward her. She looked only at the keys. She raised her right hand. The sleeve of the gray coat slipped down a little, revealing her wrist. She hovered her fingers over the ivories, searching for the right starting note. It was a position she had practiced in her mind 1,000 times, usually while lying in bed or sitting at the kitchen table. But this was real. The air smelled of lemon polish and old wood, not their cramped apartment. Julia was 10 feet away. "Lily," she called out, but her voice was swallowed by the vastness of the room. It came out as a whisper, a desperate plea. The guard paused. He was close enough now to grab the child, but something made him hesitate. Maybe it was the way the child stood. She wasn't fidgeting. She wasn't banging on the instrument like a kid playing a toy. She was still. She was focused. The big man lowered his hands, his curiosity getting the better of him. He wanted to see what would happen. Lily took a deep breath. Her small chest rose and fell inside the big coat. She flexed her fingers. Then she brought her hand down. She didn't hit the keys. She pressed them. The sound that came out wasn't a clumsy plunk or a discordant noise. It was a single, clear, full chord.
A C major.
It rang out through the hall, cutting through the tension like a knife through warm butter. The note vibrated in the air, hanging there, suspended in time. It wasn't the sound of a child playing. It was a sound that demanded attention. The people in the back rows stopped talking. The waiters froze in place. The event coordinator lowered her hand. Even Julia stopped running, her foot hovering in midair, arrested by the beauty of that single sound. Lily didn't pull away. She held the chord, letting the sound fade naturally until it was just a hum in the strings. Then she took another breath, moved her hand slightly, and pressed the next keys. A melody, began to form. It was slow, sad, and incredibly complex. It was a piece of music that required hands much larger than hers, yet she found a way to make it work. She stood on her tiptoes to reach the higher notes, stretching her arm wide to hit the bass notes, her face a mask of intense concentration. The room, which had been so full of noise and complaints just moments ago, fell completely silent. The silence was heavy. It was the kind of silence you feel when you walk into a forest and the birds stop singing. The contrast was stunning. The messy, chaotic reality of the hotel staff, the wealthy guests, the strict rules, the money worries, it all seemed to dissolve. There was only the music. And the small child in the oversized coat making it, the sound that filled the ballroom was not the simple, plinking melody of a nursery rhyme. It was something dense and rich, a wall of sound that seemed to come from the floorboards rather than just the strings of the instrument. The initial chord had faded, but Lily didn't let the silence return for long. Her left hand pressed down on the lower keys, creating a deep, steady rhythm, while her right hand began to dance across the higher notes. It was a complex piece of music. From the very first measure, it was clear that this was not a child randomly hitting keys. There was structure, logic, and a heavy dose of emotion in the way she played. The melody was melancholy, sort of weeping sound that rose and fell like waves in a storm. Julia stood frozen just a few feet from the stage steps, her right arm still slightly extended as if she were about to grab her daughter. Her mouth was open slightly, her breath caught in her throat. She had expected Lily to bang on the keys, maybe laugh, or maybe just run away. She had expected a scene, a mess that she would have to apologize for. But this was something she had never prepared for. Her feet felt like they were cemented to the expensive carpet. She couldn't move forward, and she couldn't look away. The reaction of the room shifted instantly. The low buzz of whispers died out completely. It wasn't a slow fade. It was like someone had flipped a switch. A man near the front, who had been loudly complaining about the service, froze with his wine glass halfway to his lips. He slowly lowered it, his eyes fixed on the stage. The waiters, who had been zooming around like busy bees, stopped in their tracks. They stood in the aisles, holding heavy trays, balancing on one leg, completely forgetting their jobs. The bartender paused with a bottle mid-pour, the liquid overflowing the glass and spilling onto the counter. Unnoticed, the music grew stronger. Because Lily was so small, she couldn't reach the pedals at the bottom that sustained the sound. So she had to compensate with her hands. She played the keys harder, using the force of her small weight to push them down. The notes were crisp and distinct. The song was difficult. It required a stretch that her hands barely managed. Several times she had to quickly slide her body to the right to reach a high note, then scramble back to the left for the bass line. The oversized coat flapped around her as she moved, making her look like a little bird trying to take flight. Julia looked at the guests. Their faces were changing. The bored, annoyed expressions were gone. In their place was a look of pure confusion mixed with awe. They were looking at the piano, then at the child, then back at the piano, trying to make sense of what they were hearing. It didn't fit the picture. The child in the worn-out gray coat did not match the beautiful, sophisticated music coming from the grand instrument. The event coordinator, the woman with the headset, had stopped shouting. She stood near the speakers, her mouth slightly open. She looked down at her clipboard, then up at the stage, as if checking to see if this was on the schedule. The security guard, who had been marching toward the stage to remove the intruder, had come to a halt. He stood in the middle of the aisle, blocking the view of a couple in the back, but nobody told him to move. He crossed his heavy arms over his chest and listened, his stern face softening just a fraction. Lily was in a world of her own. Her eyes were closed now. She didn't see the hundreds of people staring at her. She didn't see the crystal chandeliers or the expensive decorations. The only thing that existed for her was the music. She swayed slightly with the rhythm, her body moving naturally to the beat. Every so often, a small frown would appear on her face when her fingers didn't move fast enough to keep up with the song in her head. But she never stopped. She never faltered. Julia felt a strange tightness in her chest, a feeling that was unfamiliar and overwhelming. It was pride, sharp and painful, mixed with a terrifying sense of exposure. She had always known Lily was special. She knew Lily heard things differently than other kids. But hearing her play an old CD on a cheap player at home was completely different from seeing her command a room full of strangers. It felt like Lily's soul was laid bare on that stage, open for everyone to see, and Julia felt responsible. She felt like she had been hiding a light under a bushel. Then now the bushel had been knocked over. The song entered a quieter passage. The crashing waves of sound settled into a gentle, trickling melody. The room was so quiet now that you could hear the soft squeak of Lily's sneakers on the pedals as she stood on her tiptoes. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning system in the ceiling. The silence of the audience was heavy. It wasn't just polite silence. It was a captivated silence. People were leaning forward in their seats, drawn toward the stage like moths to a flame. A woman in a long velvet dress, seated at the table closest to the stage, turned her head to look at Julia. She didn't look angry that a staff member's child was interrupting her dinner. She looked at Julia with tears in her eyes, then turned back to watch the little girl. It was a moment of connection that Julia had never experienced in this room before. For years, she had been invisible to these people. She was the person who filled the water glass, the person who cleared the plate. But now, through her daughter, she was seen. It was a terrifying and powerful feeling. Lily's small hands moved faster. The music was building up again, heading toward a climax. The notes ran together in a flurry of sound. Her forehead crinkled with effort. She was reaching for a high chord, her arms stretched to its limit. The gray coat slipped down her shoulder a little bit, exposing the strap of her t-shirt underneath. It was such a normal, messy detail in such a formal setting. Yet it made the scene even more poignant. The security guard shifted his weight. He looked at the manager, Mr. Henderson, who had just walked out of the kitchen doors. Mr. Henderson looked confused at first, wondering why the service had stopped. Then he heard the music. He saw the crowd. He saw the child on stage. His face turned a shade of red that Julia knew all too well. He started walking briskly toward the stage, his tie flapping over his shoulder. Panic flared in Julia's chest. The music was beautiful, but Mr. Henderson only saw a violation of the rules. He saw a staff member breaking protocol. He saw a health and safety risk. He didn't hear the art. He heard the potential lawsuit. He was marching toward Lily, his hand already raised to signal her to stop. Julia's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to run onto the stage and scoop Lily up, to protect her from the embarrassment of being dragged off. But her legs still wouldn't move. It was as if the music had pinned her to the spot. She looked at Lily's face, so full of concentration and joy. She realized that stopping her now would be a crime. It would be crushing something beautiful just because it didn't follow the schedule. Mr. Henderson was halfway up the aisle. A guest, a man in a sharp suit who Julia recognized as one of the biggest donors to the charity, stood up. Mr. Henderson had to stop to avoid bumping into him. The donor didn't look at Mr. Henderson. He didn't apologize. He simply held up a hand, palm outward, right in the manager's face. It was a stop gesture. Mr. Henderson froze, shocked by the audacity. The donor shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving the stage. And then he motioned for the manager to step back. Julia let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. The room had turned itself inside out. The hierarchy of the hotel, the bosses, the guests, the staff, had been suspended. The music was in charge now. Lily hit the final crescendo. Her hands slammed down on the keys, producing a massive, resonant sound that vibrated through the floorboards and into the soles of Julia's feet. It was a loud, triumphant declaration. Then, silence. She lifted her hands off the keys. The notes seemed to hang in the air for a long time after she stopped playing. The sound echoed off the high ceiling, bouncing off the glass walls, slowly fading away until the room was perfectly quiet once again. Lily opened her eyes. She blinked, looking around as if she had just woken up from a dream. The spell broke. She seemed to suddenly realize where she was. She looked at the hundreds of people staring at her. She looked down at her sneakers, then up at the ceiling. Her face turned bright red. She pulled the sleeves of the coat down over her hands, shrinking into herself. For a few long seconds, Nobody did anything. The guests sat frozen. The waiters held their breath. It was as if they were afraid that any noise would shatter the memory of what they had just heard. Julia saw her daughter begin to tremble. The confidence was gone, replaced by the shyness of a 7-year-old girl who had just done something very brave. Julia felt a surge of love so strong it hurt. This was her moment. Her daughter's moment, and Julia realized she wasn't just a waitress anymore, and Lily wasn't just a visitor. They were part of this night. The silence that followed the last note was not empty. It was heavy, filled with a kind of electricity that made the hair on Julia's arms stand up. It was the sound of 300 people holding their breath at the exact same time. The final vibrations of the piano strings hummed in the air, fading slowly until they were just a memory. Lily stood frozen on the stage, her small hands hovering over the keys. The rush of the music seemed to drain out of her, replaced instantly by the reality of where she was. The confidence that had possessed her just seconds ago evaporated. Her shoulders slumped forward. She looked around the room, her eyes wide and darting from face to face. The red flush on her cheeks deepened until it looked painful. She looked down at her sneakers, then up at the ceiling, and finally, she looked toward the side of the room where her mother was standing. Julia felt her legs finally unlock. She rushed forward, dodging around a table where a man was sitting with his mouth half open. Julia didn't care about the rules anymore. She didn't care about the tray she had abandoned or the manager watching her every move. She saw her daughter shrinking into that oversized gray coat, looking terrified and small, and her only instinct was to protect her. Just as Julia reached the edge of the red carpet, a sound broke the silence. It was a single clap. It came from the front of the room, from the table closest to the stage. The man in the sharp suit, the donor who had stopped the manager earlier, was sitting there. He raised his hand and brought it down against his palm in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Clap. Julia stopped and looked at him. Clap. Another person joined in. A woman near the bar, the one who had been complaining about the service, put down her drink and began to clap. Clap. Then, like a wave crashing over a beach, the applause started to spread. It wasn't the polite, scattered clapping that people give when they are just being nice. It started slow and deep, and then it grew. It built up into a roar. The sound was overwhelming. People stood up from their seats. They weren't just clapping. Some were cheering. A few people were wiping their eyes with their napkins. The atmosphere in the room had completely shattered. The rigid separation between the important guests and the staff had dissolved. The barriers of money and status seemed to melt away in the face of the raw emotion they had just experienced. For the first time all night, the room felt real. It wasn't a performance of politeness anymore. It was a genuine human reaction. Lily flinched at the noise. She covered her ears with her hands, cowering behind the piano bench. It was too much for a second. The joy of playing was gone, replaced by the fear of the crowd. Julia reached the stage steps. She didn't hesitate. She climbed up and rushed over to her daughter. She knelt down on the hard floor, ignoring the dirt on her uniform, and wrapped her arms around Lily. "It's okay," Julia whispered into her daughter's hair. "You did good. You did so good." Lily buried her face in her mother's shoulder, trembling. The applause continued to wash over them. A wall of sound that seemed to vibrate right through the stage floor. Mr. Henderson,
The manager, was standing in the aisle.
his face was no longer red with anger. It was pale with shock. He looked from the cheering crowd to the woman and child on the stage. He didn't know what to do. He had prepared a speech in his head about rules and professionalism. But looking at the guest who had stopped him, he realized that speech was useless. The donor was smiling and clapping along with everyone else. To yell at the waitress now would be to ruin the magic of the moment. The original pianist. The man with gray hair, who had been on break, walked back onto the stage. He had missed the performance, but he could feel the energy in the room. He saw Julia kneeling on the floor with the little girl. He looked at the sheet music on his stand. Then, at the empty keys where the child had just played a masterpiece from memory, he walked over to them slowly. He bent down, so he was on their level. Julia looked up, fearful that he was going to be angry that a child had touched his expensive instrument. I haven't heard that piece played with that much feeling in 30 years, the pianist said softly. He had a gentle voice, the kind of voice that was used to speaking quietly in large halls. He looked at Lily, who peeked out from Julia's shoulder. You have a gift, little one. Julia felt tears pricking her own eyes now. She just likes to listen, Julia stammered. I'm so sorry. I'll take her away. I'm so sorry for the disturbance. The pianist shook his head. He reached out and gently touched Lily's hand. Don't apologize. You just saved the evening. Everyone was bored. You woke them up. From the audience, the donor's voice boomed out. Bravo. Who is that? Who is that child? Heads turned. Waiters stopped clapping. The event coordinator walked toward the stage, looking a bit dazed but happy that the guests were happy. That was incredible, she said, looking down at her clipboard as if she wanted to write it down. Do we have her name? Julia stood up, pulling Lily with her. She felt dizzy. The spotlight was bright in her eyes. She held Lily's hand tightly. She looked out at the sea of faces. These were people who usually ignored her, who looked through her as if she were made of glass. Now they were all looking at her. They were waiting for her to speak. This is Lily, Julia said, her voice trembling slightly. She's my daughter. A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. The waitress's daughter, someone whispered. But there was no malice in the tone this time. There was awe. Lily hid behind Julia's leg, peeking out shyly. The applause started up again, softer this time, but more persistent. It was a sound of acceptance. It was a sound that said, you belong here. Julia felt a strange sensation in her chest. For years she had carried a heavy weight of worry. She worried about money, about rent, about being late, about not being good enough. She felt like she was always climbing a muddy hill, slipping back down every time she tried to get up. But standing there, with the applause surrounding her and her daughter's hand in hers, the weight felt a little lighter. She realized that she hadn't just given Lily a home and food. She had given the world something beautiful. She had protected that spark in her daughter. Even when life was dark and hard, the man in the sharp suit walked up to the stage steps. He didn't climb up, but he stood there, looking at them. He wasn't looking at Lily with pity. He was looking at her with respect. Young lady, he said, addressing Lily directly. I come to these events every year. I hear the best players in the city, but I have never heard anything like that. Never.
Ow.
Lily didn't say anything. She just squeezed her mother's hand tighter. You have a future? The man continued. He looked at Julia. You should be proud. That was a true masterpiece. Julia nodded, unable to trust her voice to speak. She felt a tear slide down her cheek, hot and fast. She quickly wiped it away with the back of her hand, not wanting to smear her makeup or look unprofessional even now. The pianist spoke up again. The bench is a bit high for her, he said to the room, his voice dry but kind. Perhaps we can find something to stand on? A few guests laughed softly. It was a warm laugh. Julia looked at the manager. Mr. Henderson was still standing in the back, but he nodded slowly. He didn't say it, but the nod meant it's okay. He wasn't going to fire her. The night had taken a turn that no one could have predicted, a turn that was out of his control. And sometimes, when things are out of control, you just have to go along with the ride. The applause began to die down, settling into a comfortable murmur of conversation. But the conversations were different now. People weren't talking about stocks or vacations. They were talking about the music. They were talking about the little girl in the gray coat. They were talking about the surprise of the evening. Julia took a deep breath. The air in the room felt different to her now. It didn't smell like perfume and wax anymore. It smelled like opportunity. She looked down at Lily. Lily was looking up at her with big eyes, the fear gone, replaced by a quiet wonder. Can I go home now, Mommy? Lily whispered. Julia squeezed her hand. Yes, baby. We can go home. She didn't grab her and run. She walked. She walked Lily through the tables, holding her head high. The guests smiled at them as they passed. A few patted Julia on the shoulder. One woman reached out and touched Lily's hair, gently, like she was touching a lucky charm. They walked through the crowd, not as invisible staff members, but as the stars of the show. They moved toward the back of the room, toward the heavy curtain that separated the kitchen from the ballroom. As they passed through the curtain, leaving the lights and the music behind, the sounds of the party faded. The kitchen was noisy and hot and smelled of grease, the complete opposite of the elegant ballroom. But to Julia, it felt welcoming. It felt real. She leaned against the stainless steel counter for a moment, letting out a long breath. Her legs were shaking. The cook, a big man with a beard, looked up from a pot of soup. "Hey, Julia," he said. "Everything okay out there?" We heard some noise. Julia looked at him, and then she looked at Lily, who was sitting on a crate taking off her big coat. A smile broke out across Julia's face, a genuine, relieved smile. "Yeah," Julia said. "Everything is okay. Everything is wonderful." She knew that tomorrow she would still have bills to pay. She would still have long shifts. But something had changed. The world had seen them. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, they were going to be okay. Asterisk, the heavy velvet curtain fell shut behind them, cutting off the applause in the golden light of the ballroom. Instantly, the atmosphere changed. The elegant, magical air of the party was replaced by the harsh reality of the kitchen. The air here smelled of frying onions, bleach, and dish soap. It was hot and humid, a sharp contrast to the cool air conditioning in the dining hall. The clatter of pots and pans and the loud hissing of the stove vents filled their ears. Julia let out a long, shaky breath that she felt like she had been holding in for hours. She leaned back against the cold stainless steel counter, her legs feeling like jelly. Her heart was still racing, beating a fast rhythm against her ribs. Lily stood next to her, looking small and tired. The excitement of the performance had faded, leaving the child looking drained. She was rubbing her eyes with the back of her hand, the oversized gray coat slipping off her shoulder again. For a moment, noticed them. The kitchen staff was in the middle of the dinner rush. Waiters were shouting orders, cooks were slamming oven doors, and dishwashers were spraying water with high-pressure hoses. It was chaotic noise, but to Julia, it sounded like safety. This was her world. She knew these sounds. She understood this chaos. The head chef, a big man named Tony, who was usually red in the face and yelling, turned around. He spotted them standing by the curtain. He stopped what he was doing, a ladle of sauce hovering in midair, and looked at them. "Julia," he asked, his voice booming over the noise of the kitchen, "what is going on out there?" "The waiters are saying the guests are going crazy. They're saying someone played the piano." Julia opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She was afraid he would be mad. She had broken a rule by bringing a child into the hotel, let alone onto the stage. Tony looked down at Lily. He saw the coat. He saw the tired look on the little girl's face. He looked back at Julia. He didn't yell. Instead, a slow grin spread across his face, crinkling the skin around his eyes. He put the ladle down and wiped his hands on his apron. "Oh, is it you, Munchkin?" Tony asked, crouching down so he was eye level with Lily. "Did you make that beautiful noise?" Lily nodded shyly. She didn't say anything, but she leaned slightly against Julia's leg. Tony laughed, a loud, happy sound. "That is amazing. Mr. Henderson came in here a minute ago looking like he saw a ghost. He didn't fire you. He just went into his office and closed the door. I think you're safe, Julia." Julia felt the last bit of tension leave her shoulders. She hadn't realized how terrified she was of losing her job until she found out she wasn't going to. It was like a physical weight being lifted off her back. "Thank you, Tony," she said quietly. "Don't thank me," Tony said, standing up. "Thank her. I haven't heard the dining room that quiet since the power went out last winter. Come on, you two. You look like you need to sit down." He walked over to a corner of the kitchen where there were some crates stacked up. He kicked a couple of them aside to make room and then signaled for them to sit. As Julia sat down, exhaling deeply, one of the dishwashers came over. He was a young guy, usually quiet, always up to his elbows in soapy water. He didn't speak English very well, but he held out a paper plate with 2 large chocolate chip cookies on it. They were slightly burnt around the edges cookies that the guests would never see. "For the musician," he said with a shy smile, handing the plate to Lily. Lily's eyes lit up. She took a cookie, her small hands breaking it in half. She offered a piece to Julia. It was such a simple gesture, so innocent and full of love, that it made Julia want to cry again. She took the piece and ate it. It was warm and sweet, the best thing she had tasted in months. They sat there for a while, just watching the kitchen work. It was a strange piece. In the other room, the most wealthy and powerful people in the city were finishing their meals, talking about the performance. But here in the back, the invisible people were celebrating in their own way. A few other servers came by during their breaks, squeezing Lily's shoulder or giving Julia a thumbs up. They all knew the struggle. They all knew how hard it was to raise a family on tips and wages. Tonight, one of them had one. Eventually, Julia looked at the clock on the wall. It was late. The rush was dying down. "We should go," Julia said softly to Lily. "It's time to go home." Lily nodded sleepily. She was full of cookie and tired from the adrenaline. Julia helped her off the crate and took her hand. They walked through the kitchen, saying goodbye to Tony and the staff. They didn't leave through the front door where the taxis were waiting for the guests. They walked to the back exit, the heavy steel door that led to the alleyway. Stepping out into the night air was a shock. The city was alive with sound sirens wailing in the distance, cars honking, the hum of traffic. It was cold. A sharp wind whipped down the alley, making Lily shiver. Julia wrapped the big coat tighter around her daughter. They walked toward the bus stop. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long dancing shadows on the sidewalk. The sidewalks were dirty, littered with old newspapers and crushed cups. It was a long walk from the fancy hotel to the bus stop that would take them to their neighborhood. They walked in silence, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was a comfortable silence. As they walked, Julia thought about the piano. She thought about the sound of the music and how it filled the room. She realized something important. She had always worried that because she didn't have money, she couldn't give Lily a good life. She thought that life was about things having nice clothes, living in a safe building, going to a good school. But tonight had shown her that life wasn't just about what you could buy. Talent didn't care about money. Beauty didn't care about bank accounts. Her daughter, a little girl in a borrowed coat playing a piano she couldn't even afford to touch, had captivated the room. The world had tried to ignore them, to push them into the background. But the music had forced them to be seen. They reached the bus stop. There was an old wooden bench there, peeling paint. Julia sat down and pulled Lily onto her lap. They huddled together to stay warm. "Mommy," Lily whispered, her eyes half closed. "Yes, baby." "Did they like it? Did they like my song?" Julia kissed the top of Lily's head. She smelled like shampoo and the kitchen grease. "They loved it, Lily. They loved it more than anything." "I was scared," Lily admitted, her voice small. "I know," Julia said. "But you were brave. You were the bravest person in that whole room. Even braver than the men in the suits?" Lily didn't say anything else. She rested her head on Julia's chest and fell asleep almost instantly. Julia sat there, holding her sleeping child, watching the headlights of the cars drive by. The bus was late. It didn't matter. She looked up at the sky. There weren't many stars in the city. The city lights were too bright and washed them out. But she knew they were there, just like she knew that life was going to be hard tomorrow. She would still have to wake up early. She would still have to pay the bills. She would still have to fight for every inch of ground. But it felt different now. It felt like there was a possibility. A door had opened, if only just a crack. It wasn't a magical fix. Money wasn't going to fall from the sky. But the doubt was gone. The doubt that she was failing as a mother, that she was crushing her daughter's potential, that doubt was gone. She knew now that Lily had something special. And Julia would walk through fire to make sure the world heard it. The bus finally rounded the corner, its headlights cutting through the dark. It groaned as it pulled up to the curb, the doors opening with a loud hiss. Julia stood up, careful not to wake Lily. She shifted her daughter's weight, climbed the steps. She didn't have a ticket for the fancy life. She didn't have an invitation to the gala. But as she walked down the aisle of the bus and found a seat near the back, she realized she didn't need one. She held the hand of the little girl who had stopped the room. She held the hand of a musician, and that was worth more than all the champagne in the hotel. Julia leaned back against the hard plastic seat of the bus, closing her eyes as the engine roared and the bus moved forward, taking them home. The hum of the engine sounded a little like music, a low, steady rhythm that promised that they would keep going one day at a time.